In 1946, while the world was still trying to comprehend the magnitude of the crimes committed during the World War II, something strange was happening behind the scenes of the justice system. In a German hospital, a doctor was attending to patients normally. He had a solid academic background, spoke with authority, and had participated in human experiments in Nazi concentration camps. Even so, he wasn't arrested. He wasn't being interrogated. He was working. This was not an isolated case. During the war, these doctors wore white coats within a system that transformed science into a tool of extermination. Afterward, some were brought before international tribunals and judged before the world. Others disappeared. But a third group followed an even more disturbing path. He was protected by silence. While cameras recorded sentences in Nuremberg, discreet decisions were made in closed offices. Reports were deemed insufficient. Testimonies were ignored, and names simply ceased to be a priority. The urgency was not for justice, it was for reconstruction, stability, and scientific advancement. Decades later, when archives began to be opened, the question returned with force. How many Nazi doctors actually paid for the crimes they committed during World War II? And how many continued living as if nothing had happened? This story isn't about what happened on the fields. That's already known. It's about what was done, with the men who were behind the syringes, the notes, and the decisions. When the world decided to look forward and not to the sides. And that's where the official version starts to fall apart. When Allied soldiers began entering the concentration camps in 1945, they didn't know exactly what they were going to find. There were rumors, fragmented accounts, stories that seemed too exaggerated to be true, but nothing prepared those men for what appeared before their eyes. And here it's important to say one thing: it wasn't a quick, clear, or organized discovery. It was confusing, shocking, difficult to comprehend, even for those who had already seen war up close. In the early days, the focus was on saving those who were still alive, extremely emaciated bodies, people unable to stand, diseases everywhere. Only later, as the weeks passed, did something different begin to stand out. In some barracks, in remote buildings, in areas that didn't seem ordinary within the camps, strange rooms appeared. Metal tables, surgical instruments, labeled vials, records written with almost obsessive precision. It didn't seem like wartime improvisation. It seemed like a method. Many soldiers didn't fully understand what they were seeing. These weren't gas chambers. They weren't just execution sites. They were spaces that someone had planned, documented, and measured. Gradually, Allied doctors began to be called in to assess survivors. And then the accounts began to repeat themselves. People talking about surgeries without anesthesia, about injections that caused extreme pain, about tests that had no relation whatsoever to treatment. These weren't isolated stories, they were patterns. What was most disturbing was realizing that these acts hadn't been committed by ordinary soldiers in moments of loss of control. They had been carried out by trained professionals, people who had studied medicine, who knew exactly what they were doing. There were names signed in the reports, dates, results. It wasn't chaotic madness, it was distorted science. At this point, something changes completely. Because until then, the horror of war was associated with military orders, ideology, and armed violence. But now another type of question arose, one that was far more uncomfortable. How did doctors reach this point? Who authorized it? Who supervised it? Who knew? Allied investigators began collecting documents, but not everything was intact. Many papers had been burned days before. Others had disappeared. Some doctors had already fled. Others were mixed in with common prisoners or trying to pass themselves off as civilians. There was no clear list. There was no manual explaining who did what. It felt like chasing something that was slipping through their fingers. At the same time, survivors were interrogated. But that wasn't simple either. Many were too weak to speak, others were afraid. Some couldn't even explain technically what had been done to them. They only knew the pain, the fear, and the feeling of having been treated like objects. Still, little by little, the pieces began to fall into place. Different camps, different doctors, similar methods, the same cold logic behind it all. It was at this moment that the world began to understand that these were not just common war crimes. There was something new there, something that went beyond the battlefield. Medicine, which should protect, had been used as a tool of destruction. And this created a huge problem: how to judge this type of crime, who should be held responsible. Only those who conducted the experiments, or also those who planned, taught, and guided them? While this discussion was beginning to take shape, much was still out of control. There wasn't enough time to investigate everyone. There wasn't the infrastructure to arrest everyone. And most importantly, there was no political consensus on how far to go. The priority in the post-war period wasn't just justice, it was reconstruction. And that began to weigh on people sooner than many realize. And this is where the story starts to get really uncomfortable. Because while the world was still trying to grasp the magnitude of what had been discovered within those camps, decisions began to be made away from the cameras, away from the survivors, away from public opinion. Some choices were made quickly, others were delayed, and the fate of the Nazi doctors began to diverge along very different paths, some visible, others almost invisible. It is precisely at this point that the story ceases to be just about discovery and becomes about what the world decided to do with the truth it had just found. And perhaps the most unsettling thing is realizing that at that moment, nobody knew for sure how far this truth would go. Part of it had already come to light, but much was still about to be revealed, and that's where this story begins to change shape. If this content is helping you see this period of World War II from an angle that is almost never shown, it's worth following the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. A simple like helps this material reach more people who also want to understand what was hidden, and subscribing ensures you don't miss the next chapters. Take the opportunity to comment on which city you're watching from. This story crossed borders, and it's important to know where you're looking at it from. After the initial shock of the discoveries in the fields, something even more difficult came: transforming shock into proof. Because seeing something with your own eyes is one thing, but proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it had been done systematically in a planned manner and with the direct participation of doctors during World War II is quite another. And this is where the story becomes more tense, more confusing, and, at many points, frustrating. In the first few months, the Allies were dealing with a huge problem. There were thousands of scattered documents, many incomplete, others written in technical language, codes, or abbreviations. It wasn't like finding a note saying, "We did this." They were clinical reports, graphs, tables, test results, cold observations about pain, endurance, time to death. For those outside the medical field, it seemed almost impossible to decipher. Therefore, Allied doctors were urgently called in to help understand what those papers really meant. Meanwhile, survivors were being interviewed. And here it's important to pause for a moment, because this process was neither simple nor quick. Many people couldn't speak. Others mixed up dates, confused names, and couldn't technically explain what had been done to them. And this generated distrust among some investigators, not because they thought the people were lying, but because their physical and psychological state was devastating. Still, when the accounts began to repeat themselves, field after field, country after country, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. The most disturbing detail is that the accounts matched the documents. One survivor spoke of extreme cold tests. Elsewhere, a report emerged describing exactly that, with data, measurements, and signatures. Another spoke of injections that intentionally caused infections. Soon after, notes appeared about tests involving diseases. Gradually, what seemed like chaos began to come together like a cruel jigsaw puzzle. But there was a huge problem along the way: time. Many of the doctors involved knew they would be sought after. Some burned files. Others fled using false identities. There were cases where entire documents disappeared days before the troops arrived. In certain camps, medical rooms were empty, too clean, as if someone had been there just to erase traces. This delayed investigations and, in some cases, made it impossible to directly link a specific doctor to a specific crime. Another delicate point was the hierarchy. It wasn't always clear who had performed the tests, who had supervised them, and who had only authorized them on paper. Some doctors claimed they were simply following military orders. Others said the experiments had scientific value, and there were also those who tried to hide behind bureaucracy, claiming they weren't physically present when the tests took place. Proving individual responsibility became a huge challenge. Meanwhile, outside of Germany, public opinion was beginning to learn about some of what was being discovered. Newspapers published shocking accounts, but without many technical details. The horror was conveyed in simple words, because no one yet had the courage or perhaps the interest to show everything. The image of the doctor as a symbol of care was beginning to crack, and this deeply disturbed society. It was not easy to accept that educated, respected men had participated in something like this. Behind the scenes, the Allies debated how to proceed. It was no longer possible to treat these as ordinary crimes. But there was also no clear model at that time for judging doctors for scientific experiments. It was new territory, a type of crime that didn't fit neatly into either military or traditional civil law. Each collected run increased the pressure for an appropriate response. And while investigators were still gathering documents, cross-referencing testimonies, and trying to identify those responsible, a feeling began to spread. Not everyone would be caught. Not for lack of guilt, but for lack of solid evidence, time, and above all, the political will to see it through to the end. Some choices were already being made there, silently, while the evidence gathering was still underway. It is precisely at this point that the story begins to change tone, because, as the evidence accumulated, it became clear that the world would have to decide something bigger than just who was guilty. It would have to decide how to judge, who to judge, and who might never even face a trial. And that decision was closer than many people imagine. As the evidence was being gathered and the accounts began to paint a clearer picture, a dilemma arose that no one had faced before. It was no longer a question of discovering what had happened. That was already evident. The question now was different, far more uncomfortable. What to do with these doctors? And believe me, this discussion was neither simple, nor quick, nor unanimous. It took place in closed rooms, among military personnel, jurists, politicians, and international law experts, all trying to deal with something that simply had no precedent. Until that moment, the idea of judging doctors for crimes committed in the name of science seemed almost unthinkable. War crimes, yes. Mass murders, yes. But doctors, people with degrees, with university education, who theoretically acted according to scientific logic. Many still had difficulty accepting this, and this resistance didn't just come from defeated Germany. It also came from allies who feared opening a door that was too dangerous. If these doctors were judged, how far could this kind of responsibility go in the future? At the same time, ignoring what had been discovered was impossible. The evidence was too strong. The testimonies matched. The documents, even incomplete ones, showed method, repetition, and intent. It was no longer possible to pretend that these were isolated excesses or individual deviations. It was clear that there was an entire medical system operating within the Nazi machine, and this system had names, positions, and hierarchy. That's when The idea of separating things arose. Instead of mixing doctors with generals and political leaders, it was decided to create a specific trial focused exclusively on medical crimes. This decision in itself already said a lot. It recognized that those acts were not just common war crimes, but something new, something that demanded an unprecedented response, something that put medical ethics itself on trial before the world. This choice was not automatic. There were intense debates about who should be included, what crimes could be prosecuted, and to what extent it was possible to hold someone accountable for something that, at the time, was not clearly defined as a crime in international legal terms. Many argued that the doctors were only following orders. Others pointed out that no professional oath permitted such behavior. The tension was constant because any decision there would create a historical precedent. Meanwhile, lists began to be compiled. Names came and went. Some doctors were considered too central to be ignored. Others remained in a grey area, neither entirely innocent nor easily accused. There was pressure to act quickly, but also fear of making a mistake. A poorly conducted trial could weaken everything. It could turn the guilty into victims or generate international distrust. Another delicate point was the public exposure. These trials would be followed by the entire world. There was no room for improvisation. Each accusation needed to be supported by solid evidence. Each testimony needed to be carefully analyzed. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about showing that there were clear limits, even in times of war, and that these limits had been consciously crossed. When the decision was finally made to bring these doctors to trial, it became clear that this would not be just another chapter in the post-war tribunals. It would be something separate, specific, almost surgical, a trial that would not only analyze actions, but principles, that would not only discuss deaths, but choices, that would not only put individuals in the dock, but an entire way of thinking. This decision completely changed the course of history, because from that moment on, Nazi doctors ceased to be merely suspects scattered amidst the chaos of the post-war period. They became direct targets of a formal investigation, with names, dates, and clear accusations being prepared. And although many were still free at that time, the fate of some was already beginning to be decided. But what almost no one realized at that moment was that this decision also created divisions. Not everyone would be brought to trial. Not everyone would be reached. While some names quickly advanced toward trial, others began to disappear from the lists, either due to lack of evidence or political choices made away from the spotlight. And it is precisely when the court begins to take shape that these differences become impossible to ignore, and the story enters its most exposed, most public, and at the same time most selective phase. When the trial finally began, many people thought they already knew what to expect. After all, World War II had just exposed enormous crimes, leaders were already on trial, and shocking images had already circulated. But what happened there was different. The atmosphere was different. It wasn't an ordinary courtroom, and neither were the defendants. They were doctors, men who spoke calmly, used technical terms, cited scientific articles, and tried to present themselves as rational professionals amidst a chaos that, according to them, they didn't fully control. From the very first days, it became clear that this trial would not be simple. The accusations went far beyond military orders or blind obedience. The prosecutors began presenting detailed documents, medical reports, charts, and observation records made during the experiments. Nothing seemed improvised. Everything had a method, a routine, a repetition. And this made the situation even more serious, because it made it clear that those actions had not been exceptions, but part of an organized system. The survivors' testimonies completely changed the atmosphere in the room. They weren't rehearsed speeches nor generic accusations. They were direct accounts, often confused, full of pauses, of silences difficult to bear. People explained how they had been chosen for tests, how they were taken to medical rooms without explanation, how they felt. Their bodies fail, while someone coldly noted each reaction. At several moments, the court fell into absolute silence. There was no way to treat this merely as a legal debate. The doctors in the dock reacted in different ways. Some maintained a cold, almost distant posture, as if they were witnessing something that didn't concern them. Others showed irritation, interrupted, tried to correct terms, questioned the scientific validity of the accounts. And there were those who simply shut down, avoiding eye contact, as if they were just waiting for it all to end soon. One of the most common defense strategies was the same: to claim that everything had been authorized by the state, that there was a context of war, that science needed to advance to save soldiers. In other words, they were trying to transform crimes into necessities. But this argument was beginning to crumble as the details came to light, because it wasn't about medical treatment. It was about deliberately causing pain, suffering and death, without any real intention of healing. What made the trial even more tense was the fact that he was creating something new before the eyes of the world. For the first time, it was being clearly discussed that a doctor could be held criminally liable for violating basic principles of humanity, even while claiming to act in the name of science. Every question asked in court, every answer given, was helping to define boundaries that until then had not been written anywhere. Throughout the sessions, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the idea of ignorance. The prosecutors showed how these doctors actively participated in decisions, chose methods, adjusted procedures, and evaluated results. They were not passive parts of a machine. They were a conscious part of it. And this began to become clear not only to the judges, but to those who were following everything from a distance. At the same time, the trial revealed something unsettling. Not everyone involved was there. Some names mentioned in the testimonies did not appear among the defendants. Some doctors mentioned in the documents simply weren't present. This created a strange feeling, almost a void, as if that room was only judging a part of what had actually happened. Still, each day of the trial deepened the impact of what was being exposed. It wasn't just a dispute between prosecution and defense. It was a direct confrontation between what medicine should represent and what it had become within the Nazi regime. And little by little, it became evident that the decisions that would be made there would not only affect those men sitting in the dock, they would have much greater consequences. As the sessions progressed and the weight of the evidence mounted, a question began to haunt the courtroom, even without being spoken aloud. If these doctors were convicted, what would that mean for everyone else who wasn't there? Because at that moment it was already clear that the trial was about to separate destinies. Some would be exposed to the world, others would remain out of reach. And this difference, which still seemed subtle, would soon become impossible to ignore. As the trial progressed, something became impossible to ignore. The crimes were not abstract, nor generic, nor difficult to understand. They had form, method, and repetition. And it was precisely when the details of the experiments began to be presented that the true weight of it all fell upon those following the proceedings. Until then, many people still tried to protect themselves with emotional distance. But when the experiments began to be described one by one, this ceased to be possible. The prosecutors didn't speak in vague terms. They explained exactly what had been done. People were exposed to extreme cold, often naked, for hours on end, simply to measure how long the human body could withstand it before collapsing. There was no intention of treatment. There was no attempt to save anyone. The goal was to observe, record, and repeat. In some cases, doctors tested different ways of rewarming the body, not to help, but to compare results. Everything was recorded with scientific precision. Next came reports of altitude experiments. Prisoners were placed in pressure chambers that simulated high altitudes, as if they were in airplanes tens of thousands of meters above the ground. The reactions were violent: shortness of breath, convulsions, loss of consciousness. Many died during the process. Others survived with permanent damage. Doctors observed everything, adjusted parameters, and noted each reaction as if they were dealing with laboratory objects. There were also tests with infectious diseases. People were deliberately infected with malaria, typhoid, and other illnesses, just to test medications, dosages, or the body's resistance. In many cases, treatment came too late, or not at all. Suffering was part of the process. It wasn't a side effect. It was expected. And when someone died, the body became yet another source of data. Another point that deeply shocked was the revelation of sterilization experiments. Men and women were subjected to brutal procedures, often without any adequate anesthesia, with the aim of preventing the reproduction of groups considered undesirable. These procedures had no medical urgency, no clinical benefit. They were instruments of an ideology applied through medicine. And it didn't stop there. There were reports of unnecessary surgeries, amputations without therapeutic reason, tests with unknown chemical substances, burns intentionally inflicted to study healing. All of this was presented in court directly, without embellishment, because the documents spoke for themselves. Dates, numbers, cold observations such as satisfactory reaction or death after X minutes. What was most disturbing was not just what had been done, but how it had been done. The doctors discussed these experiments amongst themselves, exchanged results, adjusted methods. There were conferences, reports sent to superiors, requests for authorization. Nothing indicated improvisation or emotional instability. It was a professional routine embedded within the Nazi system. As these details came to light, the courtroom grew increasingly heavy. Even people accustomed to dealing with war crimes found it difficult to hear all of this, because here it wasn't just about killing, but about transforming human suffering into a tool for study, about observing pain as a variable, about treating life as disposable. At the same time, an uncomfortable question arose that no one wanted to ask aloud. To what extent had this knowledge been used after the war? Because the data existed, the reports were there, and this created a silent, almost palpable unease about what would be done with all of it. As the experiments were detailed, it became clear that the trial wasn't just revealing crimes. It was exposing something even bigger, a boundary that had been crossed and could no longer be ignored. But while the world was shocked by what was being shown, another question was slowly beginning to take shape behind the scenes. Now that all this was out in the open, what would the real price be for those in charge? Because experiencing horror was one thing, deciding the fate of those who produced it was quite another. When the sentences began to be announced, the atmosphere was no longer one of surprise, but of tension. Everyone, following the trial, knew that there would be no single, simple, or satisfactory outcome. And that is exactly what happened. Some doctors heard the maximum sentence, death penalty, hanging. The court made it clear that, for those cases, there was no possible justification. The crimes were considered too serious, too deliberate, too planned. The message seemed direct. Certain limits cannot be crossed, neither in the name of science nor in the name of war. But at the same time, other sentences sounded quite different. Long prison sentences, it's true, but still limited. 10 years, 15 years, life imprisonment in some cases, and there were also those acquitted. Doctors who heard the verdict and left the court free, claiming insufficient evidence or indirect involvement. For those observing from the outside, this created a difficult feeling to swallow. How could someone connected to that system simply walk away? The execution of those condemned to death took place in 1948. It was quick, silent, almost bureaucratic. There was no spectacle, There were no grand speeches. To the world it seemed like the closing of a chapter, a kind of symbolic full stop. The idea conveyed was clear. Justice had been done. Those responsible had been punished. History could move on, but that feeling didn't last long, because, as the details of the sentences began to circulate, one thing became clear: that trial had only reached a portion of the doctors involved. It wasn't a suspicion, it was a fact. Many names mentioned during the proceedings never appeared in the dock. Some had already disappeared before the investigations even began. Others simply weren't considered a priority, and that didn't happen by chance. While some doctors awaited execution or the serving of their sentences, others were far away, hidden in organized escape routes, using false documents, relying on support networks that functioned with surprising efficiency. These routes, often passing through Italy and continuing to South America, helped dozens of Nazis, including doctors, disappear from the radar. It wasn't improvisation, it was structure. And there was an even more troublesome group: doctors who didn't flee, weren't arrested, and weren't tried. They remained in Germany, mainly in the western part, and gradually returned to civilian life. Some resumed their profession. Others took on administrative positions. Some even worked in hospitals and universities. Their past, rarely mentioned. In many cases, simply ignored. The Cold War context helped push all of this under the rug. The priority now was reconstruction, stability, scientific advancement. Investigating all those involved in depth would require time, money, and political will, and that will begin to disappear quickly. Judging a few became enough to officially close the matter, at least in appearance. For survivors and families of the victims, this sounded like a second injustice, not only for what had been done during the war, but for what was being allowed afterward. The feeling was clear: some paid the ultimate price, while others were protected by silence, bureaucracy, or political expediency. And here something important emerges. The difference between those who were convicted and those who escaped was not merely legal. It was historical, because it shaped the narrative that would be told for decades. A narrative that spoke of exemplary justice, but avoided mentioning the flaws, the omissions, and the names that were never held accountable. As time passed, the condemned became symbols. Those who escaped became shadows. And these shadows began to grow because files remained closed, investigations were interrupted, and questions went unanswered. The public believed that everything had been resolved, but the truth was far less comfortable. And it is precisely this contrast that is beginning to weigh heavily now. Because while some Nazi doctors had their fate sealed before the world, others simply disappeared from official history. And this raises a question that can no longer be ignored. What happened to those who were never judged? That's when this story starts to get even more unsettling. Among all the names that emerged in the investigations, there was one that seemed to slip away at every turn, as if it were always one step ahead. While some doctors were arrested, interrogated, or awaiting trial, this name simply didn't appear anywhere. Not because it was irrelevant, but quite the opposite. Josef Mengele was already known to survivors, mentioned in testimonies, described in detail, and yet he wasn't there. He wasn't in the dock. He wasn't imprisoned. He wasn't even being located. Right after the end of World War II, Mengele did exactly what many tried to do, but few succeeded with such success. He blended into the chaos. He used false documents, changed his appearance, and relied on support networks that helped former members of the Nazi regime disappear. For a time, he was even detained by Allied forces, but was released because his name was not on any priority lists at that time. This says a lot about how disorganized everything still was. After that, he simply disappeared from Europe. He passed through Italy, like many other fugitives, and embarked for South America. First Argentina, then Paraguay, later Brazil. He lived for years using false names, working in ordinary jobs, leading a relatively discreet life. No cinematic hideouts, no constant pursuits. He adapted. He paid bills. He made friends. He frequented circles of German immigrants. He was an ordinary man in the eyes of those who didn't know who he really was. Meanwhile, survivors continued to speak out. Nazi hunters tried to locate him. Governments slowly exchanged information. But Mengele always seemed to escape, sometimes by small details, sometimes by sheer luck. There were moments when he was very close to being captured, but something always went wrong. A delayed piece of information, a wrong address, a decision that wasn't made in time. What's most disturbing isn't just the fact that he escaped, it's how long he managed to live in freedom. He followed the news. He knew his name was wanted. He knew he symbolized something bigger than himself, yet he was never brought to trial. He never heard a sentence. He never had to publicly answer for what he did. This creates a contrast that's hard to accept when we remember that other doctors were executed or spent the rest of their lives in prison. Mengele died in 1979 in Brazil after drowning while swimming at a beach. At the time, he was buried under a different name. Only years later did tests confirm his identity. When this became public, the reaction was immediate. There was no sense of closure. There was frustration, a feeling that something essential had been left unresolved, that justice, in that case, simply hadn't been served. Mengele's case became a powerful symbol not only of the crimes committed during the war, but of what came after. He represented everything that had escaped notice, everything that remained unresolved. Each year he lived in freedom was a silent reminder that not all those responsible faced the consequences of their actions. And what's most unsettling is realizing that he wasn't the only one. Mengele became famous because his name was repeatedly mentioned, because his story came to light. But while everyone was looking at him, other lesser-known doctors followed similar paths. Far from the courts, far from the headlines, his case opens an uncomfortable door to a bigger question, one that is beginning to gain weight now. If someone so well-known managed to escape for so long, how many others simply disappeared without a trace? While some famous names became symbols of escape and impunity, another reality was unfolding in a much quieter and perhaps more disturbing way. Many doctors linked to the Nazi system didn't need to flee, change their identities or cross oceans. They simply stayed. They stayed in Germany, especially in the western part, and waited for the right moment to resume their lives. There was no intense persecution, no constant pressure. In many cases there was waiting, paperwork, silence, and then normality. It's important to understand the context. Post-war Germany was in institutional ruins. Hospitals needed to function, universities needed to reopen, and qualified professionals were scarce. And doctors, regardless of their past, were seen as essential for reconstruction. This wasn't said aloud as an absolution, but it functioned as one. Many had their records re-evaluated, complaints were deemed insufficient, and investigations were shelved due to lack of priority. And so, little by little, these doctors returned to wearing their white coats. Some resumed their positions in public hospitals, others went into the private sector. Some returned to academic careers, teaching, supervising research, and training new generations of doctors. The past rarely mentioned. In many professional records it simply didn't appear. In others it appeared vaguely, diluted in bureaucratic terms. It wasn't exactly a lie, it was a careful erasure. For those who had survived the camps, this was almost impossible to accept. To imagine that someone who had participated in human experiments was now treating ordinary patients, prescribing medication, and receiving social respect. But this contradiction was gradually normalized. The discourse was always the same. There is no direct evidence. There was no conviction. We must move on. And moving on at that moment meant not looking back. The Cold War played a significant role in all of this. With the world divided into blocks, the priority became stability, political alignment, and scientific advancement. In-depth investigation of each professional's past was not advisable. Opening new trials could generate internal instability and international friction. Therefore, the choice was pragmatic. Some of the guilty parties had already been punished. That would suffice. The result was a kind of forced coexistence with the past. In small and large cities, there were respected doctors who carried stories that no one wanted to hear. In many cases, colleagues knew. In others, they suspected, but no one spoke. Silence became an unwritten rule, a tacit agreement between institutions, governments, and society. Decades later, as archives began to be opened and historical research advanced, these cases came to light. Names reappeared. Trajectories were re-evaluated. It was discovered that doctors with direct links to experiments had enjoyed long and comfortable careers in the post-war period. Some died without ever being publicly questioned. Others lived long enough to see their stories exposed, too late for any legal consequences. This process revealed something uncomfortable. Justice didn't fail simply due to incapacity. In many cases, it failed by choice. A choice to prioritize the present, to avoid conflict, to protect institutions. There wasn't a grand announcement saying, let's forget. There were small decisions added up over time, all pointing in the same direction. And when you look at this scenario as a whole, the feeling is that the fate of Nazi doctors was far more unequal than is usually admitted. Some paid with their lives, others paid with years in prison, and many paid nothing. This was not an exception. It was part of the post-war arrangement. Perhaps the most unsettling thing is realizing how these stories remained outside the public debate for so long, not because they were unknown, but because they were inconvenient. And this connects directly to what we saw before. While some escaped by running, others escaped by staying. Two different paths leading to the same place, far from justice. And this realization begins to completely change how we look at everything that came after. After everything that had been revealed, the experiments, the trials, the convictions, and especially the escapes and silences, a feeling arose that was difficult to ignore. Something needed to change so that it would never happen again. It wasn't enough to punish a few guilty parties. It wasn't enough to say it was a mistake of the past. The world needed to create clear, simple, and non-negotiable boundaries. And it was precisely from this need that the organization, program, etc. was born. Nuremberg Code. The curious thing is that this code didn't emerge as a grand, consensus-based international plan. It was born almost as a direct response to unease. During the doctors' trials, judges and prosecutors realized they were dealing with a huge problem. Many of the crimes committed didn't violate clearly written medical laws at the time. Moral principles existed, yes, but no objective rules that could be stated without room for discussion. This left a dangerous loophole. If there were no explicit rules, others could repeat the same discourse in the future. So the question became simple and brutal. What can never be allowed, regardless of the situation? War, political pressure, scientific advancement. None of that could ever again be used as an excuse. The answer came in the form of direct, almost obvious principles, but which until then had never been put on paper with such clarity. The most important of these was consent. It seems basic today, but at that time it wasn't treated as something absolute. The code made it clear that no one could be subjected to experiments without freely agreeing, without coercion, without deception. The person needed to understand what was being done, the risks involved, and have the right to say no. This point alone dismantled the entire logic of the Nazi experiments. Another essential principle was the right to interrupt the experiment. If the person felt extreme pain, fear, or simply wanted to stop, they could. The doctor would not have the authority to continue. This completely reversed the power dynamic seen in concentration camps, where the patient had no voice, no choice, and no value. The code also stipulated that experiments could only be conducted if there was a genuine reason, if the risks were proportionate, and if there was no less dangerous way to obtain that knowledge. Scientific curiosity was not enough. Military interest was not enough. Human life became the ultimate limit. But here's an important and rarely discussed point. The Nuremberg Code didn't just emerge as protection for the future. It also functioned as an uncomfortable mirror for the present. By defining these rules, the world was admitting, albeit indirectly, that they had been violated because they weren't clearly established before. It was a way of saying, now we know where we went wrong. Even so, the application of the code was neither immediate nor universal. Many countries were slow to incorporate it in practice. In some places, it was seen only as a document linked to the Nazi case, something far removed from normal medicine. This created another contradiction. While the code became a global ethical reference, questionable practices continued to occur in other contexts, albeit on a smaller scale. Over time, however, it came to influence medical research, hospital protocols, and international legislation. It became the basis for ethics committees, research authorizations, and debates on human rights. Today, almost every study involving human beings bears, directly or indirectly, the mark of what was decided there. But perhaps the most profound impact lies not in legal texts, but in the change of mentality. After Nuremberg, it became impossible to pretend that science and morality are separate. It became clear that knowledge without limits can become a weapon, and that doctors, scientists, and researchers cannot hide behind titles or institutions. Nevertheless, this ethical response was born amidst failures, silences, and difficult choices. The Nuremberg Code represents enormous progress, but it also carries the weight of everything that had to happen for it to exist. It is, at the same time, a protection and a constant reminder of what happens when there are no clear rules. And perhaps that's precisely why it connects so directly with what we've seen before. Because while some doctors were judged and others escaped, the world was trying to create something bigger than specific individuals, something that would serve as a permanent barrier. The question that is beginning to form now is inevitable. Even with new rules, has the world truly confronted the past, or has it simply found a more comfortable way to move forward? For a long time, it seemed that the story had ended there. Judgments made, sentences given, an ethical code created. To the general public, the matter was resolved. But this end only existed on the surface. Beneath it, there were decades of silence, discomfort, and questions that no one asked aloud. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't want to deal with the answers. In the years following the war, openly discussing the role of Nazi doctors was not a priority. Germany needed to rebuild. The world was entering the Cold War, and there was a collective rush to move on. Archives were closed, documents were restricted, investigations stalled midway. In universities, hospitals, and scientific institutions, the topic was simply not addressed. It wasn't taught. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't questioned. It was as if it all belonged to a past too distant to disturb the present. This silence wasn't officially imposed, but it functioned as if it were. Uncomfortable stories rarely gained traction. When they did emerge, they were treated as exceptions, not as part of a system. Many doctors who had emerged unscathed from the post-war period continued living normal lives, some with respected careers, others with academic recognition. Society tolerated this without directly confronting the problem. It was easier not to ask. It was only decades later, mainly from the 1980s and 1990s onwards, that this scenario began to change. Archives began to be opened. Researchers gained access to previously classified documents. Historians began to cross-reference data, names, and trajectories, and little by little, a much more complex picture began to emerge. It was discovered that the collaboration between medicine, science, and the Nazi regime had been much deeper and broader than officially admitted. These historical revisions caused discomfort, not only because they revealed new names, but because they dismantled the idea that everything had been resolved in the courts. It became clear that many doctors had never been tried, that investigations had been interrupted, and that political choices had shaped the scope of justice. The simple narrative of good triumphed over evil no longer held up so easily. At the same time, these revelations began to influence broader debates about ethics, professional responsibility, and historical memory. The question ceased to be simply, what did they do? And became, why did we remain silent about this for so long? This questioning affected not only Germany, but the entire international community which, to a greater or lesser degree, had preferred to look to the future without fully confronting the past. And that's where the most profound legacy of all this comes in. The case of the Nazi doctors didn't just change medical rules or ethical codes. It changed how the world came to see the relationship between science and power. It showed that knowledge, when detached from moral limits, can become extremely dangerous. It showed that titles, diplomas, and institutions don't guarantee ethics. And it showed that obeying orders doesn't erase responsibility. Today, whenever medical ethics, research with human beings, consent, or the limits of science are discussed, this story is there, even if it is not always mentioned directly. It serves as a permanent warning, a reminder that progress cannot come at any cost, that the line between advancement and abuse is more fragile than it seems. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire legacy is something else entirely. It doesn't just talk about Nazi doctors, it talks about collective choices, about what a society decides to investigate, punish, forget, or postpone. It talks about how silence also builds history, and about how incomplete justice leaves marks that span generations. When you look at all of this together, it becomes impossible to see this story as something closed. It continues to resonate, not because of the crimes themselves, but because of the decisions made after them, because of the truths that took a long time to come to light, because of the responsibilities that were diluted over time. And this connects directly with everything that has been shown so far, because ultimately, understanding what happened to Nazi doctors after the war isn't just about revisiting the past. It's about confronting a question that remains relevant and uncomfortable. To what extent has the world truly learned from that? And to what extent has it simply found a more acceptable way to move forward without looking back? After everything you've just heard, tell me one thing. What shocked you the most about this story? Was it the escape, the silence, or the fact that many were never punished? Your comment is important because this exchange keeps these stories alive and makes more people reflect on them. If this content made you see World War II from a perspective that is almost never shown, leaving a like greatly helps the channel continue bringing this type of investigation. And subscribing ensures that you follow other powerful, real and inspiring stories like this one that still need to be told.